Canada is among 12 countries in the world that has made assisted dying legal. Brought into law 6 years ago, MAID continues to be a point of contention in this country. Last year alone, 10,000 Canadians died by the procedure, some finding the ability to plan their death dignifying.
To know that people do not have to wait until they are in absolute the crunch of agony, that you can leave before all of that happens.
Initially, when Bill C-7 was passed, the caveat to accessing the procedure was that one's death had to be reasonably foreseeable. Since then, the law has changed and now allows those with a serious or incurable illness, disease, or disability to access MAID as well. A special joint committee is looking into changing the restrictions once more, allowing those with mental health diagnosis and mature minors to also have access to the procedure. Critics say the law is flawed and has made it too easy for Canadians to choose death.
That while the bill says patients must be given information about services that could help alleviate their suffering, so about palliative care, about mental health or social supports, there's not actually any responsibility to provide access to those services.
Recently, 44-year-old Sathya Dhara Kovac died at the beginning of October, accessing medical assistance in dying, she says, because she didn't have enough home care support to help her cope with her disease. And some doctors are concerned as well. A recent private member's bill was defeated in the House of Commons, which would have set conscience protection rights for doctors and healthcare professionals who feel intimidated or pressured to take part directly or indirectly in providing MAID. Today on Context, medical assistance in dying. Has it become too easy in this country to die? Welcome to Context. I'm Maggie John. As you just heard, the conversation around the right to die continues in this country 6 years after medical assistance in dying became legal here. Helen Long is the CEO of Dying with Dignity, an advocacy group that supports Canadians' right to access medical assistance in dying. Welcome to the show, Helen.
Thanks, Maggie.
So 10,000 Canadians chose to access MAID last year alone. What does this say to you?
Well, I think what it says is that Canadians are becoming more familiar, more aware of the fact that assisted dying can be a choice for those who opt to go that route, and that the stigma, around assisted dying as an option is decreasing. I think it's also reflected of the changes in the eligibility criteria and just the fact that we're 6 years in. Every year the numbers do get a little higher, although we do expect them to kind of level out.
And that astonishes me. So 10,000, so the expectation is that that number will go up potentially this year when we get the numbers in?
Yeah, so that number is about, I believe it's 3.2%.
Okay.
Health Canada is on the record as having stated that they expect to see us level out around 4% or just over 4%, which is in line with the Benelux countries where assisted dying has been legal for a longer period of time.
Okay. Your website says that you provide support for adults suffering from grievous or irremediable medical conditions who wish to die on their own terms. The provisions around MAID have expanded since it went into law 6 years ago. How does Dying with Dignity feel about the allowance of those living with severe illnesses and disabilities being permitted to access MAID? And by next year, as we just heard, mental health will also be, those suffering with mental illness will also be able to access MAID as well as potentially mature minors.
Yeah, so I think we're certainly on the record as having advocated for eligibility changes to the assisted dying laws. Dying with Dignity Canada is a human rights charity, and we're focused on Canadians having the right to choose their good death. The expansions are around reasonably foreseeable, which was the change in Bill C-7. I think those are the result of a court challenge. And I think in Canada, these rules are very much governed by the Constitution and by the rights that Canadians have. So we do support and advocate for changes and perhaps increased changes. Mental disorders, made for those with mental disorders as a sole underlying mental medical condition will be legal in March of 2023. While the committee has been talking about the law, it will change. It is a sunset clause. And mature minors, certainly that's a topic of discussion. I don't know that we'll see changes in the legislation around that next year.
Now, Helen, we're hearing cases of Canadians choosing MAID because of lack of social assistance, housing, care, and families are shocked when they find out that their loved one has access to this procedure. Are Canadians being fully educated, you think, on MAID and its accessibility?
Well, I mean, I think there's always room to educate. Does every Canadian have all the facts that they need around assisted dying? No, I'm sure that they don't. So that's a continuing communication, education path that we are on. At the same time, I think it's important to remember that assisted dying is about compassion. It's about an end to intolerable suffering as a result of a disease, disability, illness, or decline related to that. And it's an individual choice. So, while we certainly can empathize and we feel for family members who perhaps were not fully involved in discussions around MAID, at the end of the day, it's an individual's right and an individual's choice to proceed with a MAID procedure.
And why is it important that Canadians have this choice when it comes to dying with assistance?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we hear from people across Canada on a regular basis is that having the ability to apply for MAID, even if they opt not to go ahead with it, just gives people a sense of comfort. They know that their suffering will end. They know that they're in control and they have autonomy again. Not every Canadian will choose MAID, but for those who want to, it can provide a great sense of relief to them.
I know that Dying with Dignity is also in favor of palliative care. Is that being given, you think, enough attention as an option when dying? And are proper provisions in place to make palliative care a viable option for Canadians?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear, and it's been very clear through the witnesses at the Joint Committee that there is not enough palliative care in Canada. There's not enough access to it. It doesn't begin early enough. I think there's a lot of information out there that talks about the need for palliative care. So we would join that call for governments to continue to increase funding, support services related to palliative care for Canadians.
All right, one final question for you, Helen. We have 30 seconds left, but I want to squeeze this in. Some have criticized Canada for making it too easy to die in this country. Do you think that's true?
It's ironic. One of the things we hear most often is that people are having such a hard time accessing an assisted death, even when they've been approved. So no, I don't think it's true. I think we're offering Canadians choice and we're offering them compassion, and that's what we should be doing.
All right, Helen Long, CEO of Dying with Dignity. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
On the other side of this debate is the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, another advocacy group. This one is trying to redirect the conversation around the end of life to one centered around palliative care. Alex Schattenberg is the group's executive director. Alex, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, it's great being with you today.
We've heard the numbers. Over 10,000 people accessed MAID last year alone. Why do you think that is, Alex?
Well, there's been a normalization of MAID or euthanasia in Canada, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that early on there were a lot of stories that we heard of different people who were going through difficult conditions, and they were the message was to Canadians that euthanasia is the answer to these conditions rather than talking about proper care. And so I think by constantly being reinforced with that message, it normalized it, and the numbers went very high very fast.
We've heard of a recent example, I'm sure you have as well, of the 44-year-old Manitoba woman who chose to die by MAID. And in a note that she left for her family, she said it was the lack of available home care that helped lead to her decision. What does that say to you?
Well, there's been a lot of cases like that. And what we have is a situation that the disability community warned about. They said that if you legalize euthanasia MAID for these reasons, such as chronic conditions, et cetera, that you're going to get a lot of people who are living in poverty. They're living in poverty and they might have other health conditions, but they qualify for MAID. So this becomes the escape mechanism of poverty. It's absolutely distressing that in a country like Canada, there's lots of stories like this. I'm getting calls all the time and I'm dealing with lots of people who are going through exactly the same situation. And I think it's very tragic that people are being killed for these reasons.
Those living with disabilities are also concerned about the new provisions, and by next year, those with mental illness will be able to access MAID, including possibly mature minors. Is it becoming too easy to die in this country, Alex?
Well, there's quite a few people I've been communicating with who tell me that they're having a hard time accessing medical treatment. Now, you talk about, medical aid in dying for people with mental illness. There's a long waiting period to get treatment for mental illness, to get into the program for mental illness treatment, and yet you can qualify for medical aid in dying reasonably quick. So this is obviously a disparity where you've got people whose only treatment available to them might be death. And that to me is once again almost a crazy situation that we've ended up here in Canada with, and needs to be redressed without a question. This shouldn't be happening this way at all. I'm concerned about people with disabilities, about they feel that their lives are not worth living, and the society seems to be agreeing with them.
You say this is about abandonment, not autonomy. What do you
That's
mean
right.
by that? And shouldn't Canadians have the freedom to choose how they die?
Well, the issue of freedom to choose, well, you have to look at what the law says itself. So the law, really, if you define the law and you look at what it says, it's really about the rules that the doctor or the nurse must do in order to approve your death. That's what it's about. So someone might request it, and that's absolutely correct. But this is what the law is about. So really, it focuses on the act that the physician is doing in order to cause your death. I'll go one step further and say, there's a lot of reasons someone might seek a death, such as poverty, such as, they're going through a very difficult time and they can't receive treatment. I was talking to a woman in Victoria, BC, who's been seeking treatment, and she says the only place I can get it is in the US, which is a crazy situation. She's trying to raise $100,000 for her treatment, but she can be approved for MAID. She says, I got approval for MAID easily. Treatment, I can't seem to get approval for. So, you have this situation where you have serious disparities. So is it too easy to get MAID? Absolutely. Should we be a caring society, not a killing society? Absolutely. But it seems to me that there's major change needed.
So what is the solution? What is that major change that's needed? What would you like to see?
Well, right off the bat, we have to change how we do MAID. I think the concept of killing someone is absolutely a wrong idea from the beginning. I think it's wrong that we have doctors and nurses have the right in law to cause your death and my death. I just think that's a crazy idea. But on top of it, how easy we've made it. So if you're going to kill people, then obviously there should be more oversight of the law, and there isn't. There really isn't. They claim that there's all these safeguards, and in fact there isn't. One final thing: the law says that the doctor or the nurse only has to believe that to be of the opinion that you fit the criteria of the law. So when you get a situation like Alan Nichols, who died by euthanasia in 2019, and his family were shocked. How did Alan die by euthanasia? How could this have happened? And when they did an investigation, the RCMP came back and said, the doctors were of the opinion you fit the criteria of the law. Well, that's what the law says. So you only have to be of the opinion. So obviously speaking, there was no redress for the Nichols family, and Alan was dead. You can't bring him back from the dead. This is the kind of thing we're having in Canada, and to me, it's gone way, 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 way too far. I don't think we should be killing anybody, but how we're doing it is actually become we're the most permissive now nation in the world. How
Alex,
our rules are.
Alex, we have 45 seconds. Palliative care, talk about that. You say, that needs to be addressed a lot more and needs to be an option for Canadians.
Yeah. Well, we believe in caring for people, not killing them. That's what we believe in. So we absolutely believe that there needs to be a focus on how we care for people, allow a true death with dignity, which is a natural death where people are actually caring for you, making sure you're kept comfortable, and options for them. I think what's happening right now is people are feeling steered to one direction because that's the option that's the most easiest one for them to get, and that is called medical aid in dying. It's not called life with dignity and death with dignity. Death with dignity would be caring for them, allowing them to die a natural death, being comfortable and having people around them who are helping them.
All right. Thank you so much, Alex Schattenberg, Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Pastor Paul Charbonneau has counseled many over his years in ministry, and the choice to die by assistance is a conversation he has had on a few occasions. Pastor Paul Charbonneau joins me now. Thank you for joining me today, Pastor Paul.
Bless you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So besides being a part of a denomination that doesn't allow clergy to take part in medical assistance in death, how do you personally feel about this?
Well, again, when I came to Christ, I sort of I felt like the whole thing was about life. You know, the whole thrust of the scriptures is about life. That Jesus came to bring life and the fullness of life. So right from the very beginning, when we became a Christian, this is almost like 45 years ago, we got involved with basically pro-life issues. And so this is just another manifestation of what we're facing in our culture today.
You tell the story of meeting one man who had chosen MAID after losing his wife to cancer, and you say
Right.
more could have been done. What do you mean by that? That more could have been done for that man?
Well, I think I'm thinking about, first of all, like he was, I don't think he understood all of the ramifications of what he was doing. As far as, you know, the impact that would have on not only his children, but his grandchildren too. What was he saying in what he was choosing? I think we probably could have done a better job of, you know, giving him the full picture of this. But on the other hand, just his personality was, he was a very difficult person to give another point of view. I'll tell you something, I argued with him for months about this, but I think he was that kind of person who just, he had already had his mind made up.
Pastor Paul, do you think you can value life and still choose to die with assistance?
Well, like that's a great question, because we're not just talking about theories here. We're talking about real people. We are doing a disservice to the gospel by going forward with this. You know, what comes to mind is Jesus on the road to Emmaus. You know, it's basically the same kind of thing. This is a death has happened, although the people didn't realize who they were talking to. But Jesus walks alongside them. He hears them. He listens to them. And yet at the end of the story, he corrects their thinking on life and death issues. You do not know the scriptures. He points them to the reality of the truth of the God that they're discussing at that point. So I think he comes alongside them, but in the end, he has to correct their wrong ideas.
Yeah.
And as hard as that is sometimes, I think we need to do that.
10,000 Canadians, Pastor Paul, accessed MAID last year alone. What does that say about the state of our country when it comes to this matter and the deep desire that these people have to die? Years
ago, people were informed by basically the word of God. You know, it was more of a Christian context. But since the Enlightenment, it's sort of like the reverse, where we basically decide what is right and what is wrong. And it's usually very me-centered. It's all about me, instead of there's another, you know, one giving us leadership in life. I think it's a very different context that we're living in today. So, and I think people think, you know, like, and this just happened to me just a couple of weeks ago, where someone said to me, you know, I don't want to be a burden on my family. You know, that's the common thing we hear. I don't want to be a burden on my family. But the fact of the matter is, we're all burdens on each other. You know, babies are burdens. Teenagers are burden. I'm a burden. You know, that's the reality of life. And I think it stretches people to think, no, I need to take care of my aging parents. But we're living in a culture today that is so incredibly me-focused that it's, you know, I know I sound like a dinosaur when I talk about this kind of stuff, but.
Well, I think of the scripture that says, "Come to me, all who are heavy burdened, and I will give you rest." And I think that's where you're going with that sentiment, so that we don't have to carry this burden, but that we can give it to Jesus.
Absolutely.
Pastor Paul Charbonneau, thank you so much for your time today, sir.
Okay, bless you.
Coming up, the Q. Has it become too easy to die in Canada? Do we value life in this country? We will discuss.
In our fast-paced world, context is everything to the stories that are shaping us. We want to go beyond the headlines in our new podcast to create space for meaningful conversations, to explore where faith intersects with justice, ethics, culture, and society. We'll be joined by newsmakers, peacemakers, and culture shapers. Join us on all podcast platforms or at contextbeyondtheheadlines.com.
I don't think that equality and dignity necessarily means a fast track to death, right? One should be provided with the resources to live with dignity as opposed to a fast track to die with dignity, so-called.
That was Nancy Hansen. She is a professor of disability studies at the University of Manitoba, sharing her concerns about medical assistance in dying. I'm joined again by the Q panel. Renee and Moira are here. Brian is away, so we're joined by Andrea Senna, Director of Policy at Cardis. Thank you all for joining us today. All right, today we're talking about MAID and the changes that continue to be made around the access to this procedure. Is dying in this country proving to be easier and easier, Moira?
Oh, for sure. It's really quite fascinating, Maggie, that the safeguards that were said to be there in 2016 when the legislation was passed was supposed to prevent, if you like, expansion and having MAID restricted to specific situations. And since then, of course, there have been all sorts of extensions, including this recent one that is touted as being available for people with mental illness, scheduled to come up in February 2023. So that, coupled with the increase in numbers since the legislation passed, I think that goes to show that, while it's not incredibly easy, and something like that, of course, never should be or could be, it's certainly a lot easier. And the safeguards that were said to sort of put a hold on expansions, they've been shot down one by one.
Yeah, the critics are out there and they're saying, just there was a big article in the New York Times also criticizing Canada for being an easier country to die. Andrea, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's certainly been the case that the critics who warned of the slippery slope have shown that their concerns have come to pass. And, Cardis previously conducted some research on the attitudes of Canadians towards medical assistance in dying. This was back in 2020. And even at that time, many of the Canadians who were sort of cautiously optimistic or cautiously supportive, I should say, of the procedure maintained their concerns around, access to this procedure for those who are vulnerable, the elderly, people with disabilities, people with mental illnesses. And so I think it's an unfortunate confirmation for those who were concerned about the expansion of this procedure that yes, appears to be getting easier, although it does seem that more people are ringing the alarm bells around the concerns for this as it expands as well.
Yeah, it does seem like the alarm bells are ringing a lot louder than they were in the initial stages. Medical assistance in dying has morphed from being a procedure accessible to those with foreseeable death to now being one that is accessible, as you said, Andrea, to a growing number of people in the community, including those living with disability and soon mental illness. What does this say to this demographic specifically, Renee?
Well, I think it speaks to the currency that we place on life, and that perhaps life is the value of a life is measured in terms of social utility, right? And we are reading with all of the reports and the articles and opinions that are coming out that perhaps there can be a social approach or understanding that we can take care of the vulnerable to a certain point. And then when it's far too intense to give care or far too burdensome, and let's talk about the dollars here for a minute, then death by suicide is an option. So I think it says something about the value that we place on a life in this country, that this procedure is becoming accessible to all. But I question accessibility, though, because at the end of the day, the number one safeguard is request by request. in all of the dissenting articles and op-eds that we've read, it seems to me that there are cases surfacing where, in fact, MAID was offered by a medical ethicist, a practicing medical practitioner in a hospital, for instance, and also that access to that procedure seems far more easier and less complicated than struggling to get accessible and affordable and timely care, whether it's for a mental illness, whether it's for housing, whether it is food. I mean, we need to begin to question why people are going to request MAID versus other options to live in the face of adversity.
Well,
so we have a long way to go.
Let's explore that a little bit more, Renee. You're right. I mean, 10,000 people alone just last year accessed MAID. And so there are a growing number of cases where people are choosing death because of a lack of access to services and proper housing and care. What are your thoughts about that, Moira?
I think those particular cases, fortunately, perhaps are still small. So we were reading about that idea, if you can't give me housing, I'll choose to die, because that two people couldn't live in specific situations because of the health effects that they had. But small numbers, referring back to that slippery slope aspect, certainly mean that more people might begin to think that way. But I think it does reflect a real crisis in our healthcare. Not only do many physicians think, because it's legal, that this is something that they could in fact offer, being requested is yet just another facet that I think will disappear. But there are so many areas, especially in mental health situations, where we're not talking about terminal illness, we're not talking about foreseeable death. We're talking about situations where, in fact, people could be cured. And it isn't always the case that they have difficult social situations. I think we have to be really careful, especially around the question of consent, especially again in the area of mental illness, that whole principle of law is a moral area and it's a legal area. We are not really supposed to have anything done unless we're able to give full consent. And it's really difficult for many people to think that people with serious mental illnesses actually have the capability of giving that consent. So there are healthcare issues, there are social issues, there are these types of legal issues, and then there's a very basic moral issue that I think the country still has to confront about whether it's ever right for somebody to take his or her own life.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to have to call it there. Moira, Renee, and Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today. Over the past 24 seasons here at Context, the team has covered the topic of euthanasia or medical assistance in dying many times. The issue is complex and both sides have valid points. The reason we chose to cover it again this time is because a mom reached out to us when she found out her 23-year-old son, who had lost partial eyesight due to type 1 diabetes, had been granted access to MAID without her knowledge. An illness that millions live with all over the world was deemed enough for a 23-year-old to be granted the ability to end his life. The mom was afraid to talk to us on camera. Life is valuable. It is a gift, short or long. How you choose to share that gift is left for each of us to decide. But how do we show the people in our lives that they are valued? How do we remind those living with illnesses or disabilities that there is a place for them in this world as flourishing individuals and support them when they need it? So that if that day comes where one has to make a decision about life, they can do it from a place of value instead of a place of burden and pain. Thank you for watching. Let us know what you think of today's topic. Join the conversation on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. For all of us here, I'm Maggie John. See you next time.
Thank you for your ongoing support of Crossroads, a supporter-funded nonprofit organization and member of the Canadian Centre for Christian Charities. Thanks to faithful people like you, we are able to continue producing Context. You can write to Crossroads, P.O. Box 5100, Burlington, Ontario, L7R 4M2, or visit crossroads.ca to learn more about our programs.
Context Beyond the Headlines invites you to an exciting new season. This year, we're expanding our reach with a brand new podcast that will explore the interaction between faith, justice, culture, ethics, and society. As we move forward with this brand new season and the launch of this brand new podcast, would you consider partnering with Context financially? It is because of the generosity of viewers like you that we're able to continue to tell the stories that matter.